Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram at snoozecast for behind-the-scenes content. If you enjoy our show, please write a review on the podcast app. Also, share us with a friend. Here's a recent review that we really appreciated and wanted to share. The subject line is, "Great, but..." It goes, "I really like this podcast, but it would be more convenient to have each story in one place. I saw another review about this, and I agree it is inconvenient to have to scroll down to find a part of the story." Thank you for writing your review. We hear you and have indeed received this feedback before. In the next year, we plan on creating a way on our website to view and listen to all the continuing episodes to a story in one place. Thanks for your patience until then. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by Fairy Powers. Tonight, we'll read the next part to our Magic Cloak series from the book Queen Zixi of Ix, or The Story of the Magic Cloak, a children's book written by L. Frank Baum and published in 1905. The Magic Cloak Episode 1 aired on November 11th, 2019. If you'd like to listen to the previous episode again, it aired October 5th, 2020. The events of the book alternate between Noland and Ix, two neighboring regions to the Land of Oz. Baum, who also wrote The Wizard of Oz, commented that this was the best book he had written. In the last episode, while Bud and Fluff glory in their new positions of authority and their possessions, Aunt Rivette wants to show off her good fortune. She asks Fluff if she can wear her cloak, and she becomes so tired walking that she wishes she could fly. Two wings sprout from Aunt Rivette's back, and she flies up in a confused panic. We'll pick up after Fluff convinces Bud that he can't just play with all of his toys all day, even if he is the supreme ruler of the land. He must do all the disagreeable things a king is supposed to do, like attending the royal receptions he is invited to. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Old Tullydub was wondering how he might best explain the king's absence to the throng of courtiers gathered to attend the royal reception, when, to his surprise and relief, His Majesty entered the room, accompanied by the Princess Fluff. The king wore a velvet suit trimmed with gold lace, and at his side hung the beautiful jeweled sword. Meg was dressed in a soft white silken gown and looked as sweet and fair as a lily. The courtiers and their ladies, who were all wearing their most handsome and becoming apparel, received their little king with great respect, and several of the wealthiest and most noble among them came up to Bud to converse with him. But the king did not know what to say to these great personages, and so the royal reception began to be a very stupid affair. Fluff saw that all the people were standing in stiff rows and looking at one another uneasily, so She went to Bud and whispered in his ear. "Is there a band of musicians in this palace?" the king inquired of Tellydeb, who stood near. "Yes, your majesty." "Send for them, then," commanded Bud. Presently, the musicians appeared, and the king ordered them to play a waltz. But the chief counselor rushed up and exclaimed, "Oh, your majesty, this is against all rule and custom." "Silence," said Bud angrily. "I'll make the rules and customs in this kingdom hereafter. We're going to have a dance." "But it's so dreadful. It's so unconventional, your majesty. It's so... what shall I call it?" "Here, I've had enough of this," declared Bud. "You go and stand in that corner, with your face to the wall, till I tell you to sit down." And he remembered a time when his father, the ferryman, had inflicted a like punishment upon him. Somewhat to his surprise, Tullydub at once obeyed the command, and then Bud made his first speech to the people. "We're going to have a dance," he said, "so pitch in and have a good time. If there's anything you want, ask for it. You're all welcome to stay as long as you please and go home when you're ready." This seemed to please the company, for everyone applauded the king's speech. Then the musicians began to play, and the people were soon dancing and enjoying themselves greatly. Princess Fluff had a good many partners that evening, but Bud did not care to dance. He preferred to look on, and, after a time, he brought old Tullydub out of his corner and made the chief counselor promise to be good and not annoy him again. "But it is my duty to counsel the king," protested the old man solemnly. "When I want your advice, I'll ask for it," said Bud. While Tullydub stood beside the throne, looking somewhat sulky and disagreeable, the door opened, and Aunt Rivette entered the reception room. She was clothed in a handsome gown of bright green velvet, trimmed with red and yellow flowers, and the wings stuck out from the folds at her back in a way that was truly wonderful. Aunt Rivette seemed in an amiable mood. She smiled and curtsied to all the people, who stopped dancing to stare at her, and she even fluttered her wings once or twice to show that she was proud of being unlike all the others present. Bud had to laugh at her. She looked so funny. And then a mischievous thought came to him, and he commanded old Tullydub to dance with her. "But I don't dance, your majesty," exclaimed the horrified chief counselor. "Try it. I'm sure you can dance," returned Bud. "If you don't know how, it's time you learned." So the poor man was forced to place his arm about Aunt Rivette's waist and to whirl her around in a waltz. The old woman knew as little about dancing as did Tullydub, and they were exceedingly awkward, bumping into everyone they came near. Presently, Aunt Rivette's feet slipped, and she would have tumbled upon the floor with the chief counselor along with her, had she not begun to flutter her wings wildly. So, instead of falling, she rose gradually in the air, carrying Tullydub with her, for they clung to each other in terror, and one screamed, "Murder!" and the other, "Help!" in their loudest voices. Bud laughed until the tears stood in his eyes, but Aunt Rivette, after bumping both her own head and that of the chief counselor against the ceiling several times, finally managed to control the action of her wings and to descend to the floor again. As soon as he was released, old Tullydub fled from the room, and Aunt Rivette, vowing she would dance no more, seated herself beside Bud and watched the revel until nearly midnight, when the couriers and their ladies dispersed to their own homes, declaring that they had never enjoyed a more delightful evening. Chapter 9. Zixi has a wish granted. Next morning, Aunt Rivette summoned Zixi to her room and said, "Take these shoes and clean and polish them, and carry down this tray of breakfast dishes, and send this hat to the milliner to have the feathers curled, and return this cloak to the Princess Fluff with my compliments, and say I'm much obliged for the loan of it." Poor Zixi hardly knew how to manage so many orders. He took the shoes in his left hand, and the tray of dishes he balanced upon the other upraised palm. But the hat and cloak were too many for him. So Aunt Rivette, calling him a stupid idiot, probably because he had no more hands, set the plumed hat upon Zixi's head and spread the cloak over his shoulders, and ordered him to make haste away. Zixi was glad enough to go, for the fluttering of Aunt Rivette's wings made him nervous. But he had to descend the stairs cautiously, for the hat was tipped nearly over his eyes, and if he stumbled, he would be sure to spill the tray of dishes. He reached the first landing of the broad stairs in safety, but at the second landing, the hat joggled forward so that he could see nothing at all, and one of the shoes dropped from his hand. "Dear me," sighed the old man. "I wonder what I shall do now. If I pick up the shoe, I shall drop the dishes, and I can't set down this tray because I'm blinded by this terrible hat. Dear, dear. If I'm to be at the beck and call of that old woman and serve the new king at the same time, I shall have my hands full. My hands, in fact, are full now. I really wish I had half a dozen servants to wait on me." Zixi knew nothing at all about the magic power of the cloak that fell from his shoulders, so his astonishment was profound when someone seized the shoe from his left hand, and someone else removed the tray from his right hand, and still another person snatched the plumed hat from his head. But then he saw, bowing and smirking before him, 6 young men, who looked as much alike as peas in the same pod, and all of whom wore very neat and handsome liveries of wine color, with silver buttons on their coats. Zixi blinked and stared at these people, and rubbed his eyes to make sure he was awake. "Who are you?" he managed to ask. "We are your 6 servants, sir," answered the young men, speaking all together and bowing again. Zixi gasped and raised his hands with sudden amazement as he gazed in wonder upon the row of 6 smart servants. "But what are you doing here?" he stammered. "We are here to wait upon you, sir, as is our duty," they answered respectfully. Zixi rubbed his left ear, as was his custom when perplexed, and then he thought it all over. And the more he thought, the more perplexed he became. "I don't understand," he finally said, in a weak voice. "You wished for us, and here we are," declared the 6, once more bowing low before him. "I know," said Zixi, "but I've often wished for many other things, and never got a single one of the wishes before." The young men did not attempt to explain this curious fact. They stood in a straight row before their master, as if awaiting his orders. One held the shoe Zixi had dropped, another its mate, still another the plumed hat, and a fourth the tray of dishes. "You see," remarked Zixi, shaking his head sadly at the 6, "I'm only a servant myself." "You are our master, sir," announced the young men, their voices blended into one. "I wish," said Zixi solemnly, "you were all back where you came from." And then he paused to see if his wish also would be fulfilled. But no, the magic cloak conferred the fulfillment of but one wish upon its wearer, and the 6 servants remained standing rigidly before him. Zixi arose with a sigh. "Come downstairs to my private room," he said, "and we'll talk the matter over." So they descended the grand stairway to the main hall of the grand palace. Zixi going first, and his servants following at a respectful distance. Just off the hall, Zixi had a pleasant room where he could sit when not employed, and into this he led the 6. After all, he considered, it would not be a bad thing to have a half-dozen servants. They would save his old legs from many a tiresome errand. But just as they reached the hall, a new thought struck him, and he turned suddenly upon his followers. "See here," he exclaimed. "How much wages do you fellows expect?" "We expect no wages at all, sir," they answered. "What? Nothing at all?" Zixi was so startled that he scarcely had strength remaining to stagger into his private room and sink into a chair. "No wages? 6 servants, and no wages to pay," he muttered. "Why, it's wonderful, marvelous, astounding." Then he thought to himself, "I'll try 'em, see if they'll really work." And aloud he asked, "How can I tell you apart, one from another?" Each servant raised his right arm and pointed to a silver badge upon his left breast. And then Zixi discovered that they were all numbered from 1 up to 6. "Ah, very good," said Zixi. "Now, number 6, take this shoe into the boot room and clean and polish it." Number 6 bowed and glided from the room as swiftly and silently as if he were obeying a command of the King of Noland. "Number 5, continued Zixi, take this tray to the kitchen." Number 5 obeyed instantly, and Zixi chuckled with delight. "Number 2, take this to the milliner in Royal Street and have the feathers curled." Number 2 bowed and departed almost before the words had left Zixi's mouth. And then the king's valet regarded the 3 remaining in some perplexity. "Half a dozen servants is almost too many," he thought. "It'll keep me busy to keep them busy. I should have wished for only 1 or 2 at the most." Just then, he remembered something. "Number 4, said he, "go after number 2 and tell the milliner that the hat belongs to Madame Rivette, the king's aunt." And a few moments later, when the remaining 2 servants, standing upright before him, had begun to make him nervous, Zixi cried out, "Number 3, take this other shoe down to the boot room and tell number 6 to clean and polish it also." This left but one of the 6 unoccupied, and Zixi was wondering what to do with him when a bell rang. "That's the king's bell," said Zixi. "I am not the king's servant. I am here only to wait upon you," said number 1, without moving to answer the bell. "Then I must go myself," sighed the valet, rushing away to obey the king's summons. Scarcely had he disappeared when Tollydob, the Lord High General, entered the room and said in a gruff voice, "Where is Zixi? Where's that rascal Zixi?" Number 1, standing stiffly at one end of the room, made no reply. "Answer me, you scoundrel," roared the general. "Where's Zixi?" Still, number 1 stood silent, and this so enraged old Tollydob that he raised his cane and aimed a furious blow at the young man. The cane seemed to pass directly through the fellow, and it struck the wall behind so forcibly that it split into 2 parts. This amazed Tollydob. He stared a moment at the silent servant and then turned his back upon him and sat down in Zixi's chair. Here his eyes fell upon the magic cloak, which the king's valet had thrown down.